I'm Perry Bacon. I'm the host of the New Republic show right now. I'm joined by the University of Iowa professor of sociology and African American studies, Louise Seamster. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And so I want to talk. You write a lot about education, about a lot about policy, a lot about kind of how our society works. You're a sociologist, so I think that's not that goes with it. So I want to talk about first of all, which is like we've had a lot of focus on what the Trump administration has done to universities and sort of focused on the university's institution. We're trying to defund this part of Harvard or get rid of UVA's president. That stuff's all very important. But I think a lot of your work has been about students. And so can you talk about, and there's a lot of policies like students in terms of how they're changing financial aid
Mhm.
and so on. Can you talk about how they're trying to change the student experience, the paying for college experience, and maybe the kind of the demographics of who's in college?
Yeah, I mean, all of these things are happening at once. So I'll start by saying it's hard to even track because a lot of the policies that are launched are floated, and then you're not sure which actually take place, or they're issued in a declaration, and you're not sure what is mobilized behind it. But as a whole, uh, we can see that at the same time that there's a lot of active investigations into universities, and as you said, attempts to kind of bring various universities to heel or like under control of the Trump administration, and exerting both like present day and future financial control over these universities. There's also a lot going on at the same time that you could argue is either trying to unwind Biden administration policies that were attempting to address the student debt crisis and actually make good on promises around debt forgiveness for existing programs or improve them. Um, and also just to that also go against a lot of the attempts over the past couple of decades about making college more affordable. What I also think is important to track is how a lot of the same narratives that people have been using, you know, up until recently are kind of getting twisted against them. So where like people like me were arguing that student debt had become a crisis, that's now getting twisted to say things like, oh, well, these schools aren't worth it, and that people are acquiring all this debt for programs that aren't worth it, so that we should do things like create caps on student loans that you can take out, or we I've seen, proposed on the table that you should take those income derived programs that already displaced hope of debt forgiveness for 20 or 25 years, and we should eliminate, what was problematic according to the Trump administration, is the debt forgiveness at the end of it. So already very, very few people were even going to get that debt forgiveness prior to Biden's, temporary waivers and fixes. But this is saying that what was problematic was the fact that people at least had the hope of having loan forgiveness at the end. This is going to make, and it's already making a lot of either current or prospective students very concerned, including my own students. They talk about their concerns with me and their uncertainty, and I don't know what to tell them anymore about what is going to happen. A student yesterday I was talking to was expressing concern about the changes potentially to the professional degrees qualifications, such that it might limit how much debt you can take out for a graduate degree, especially for programs like public health or I believe nursing. So that would have it's all of these things together are going to negatively affect the same students who are already the most affected by the student loan crisis, which is students of color and women, and people who have been targeted by colleges in a lot of different ways. And we should definitely be concerned about that as well.
So in the big beautiful bill, there actually are some changes to student aid policy themselves, right? It makes it harder to take out loans and so on.
Yes, I believe so. And I will say I have not looked too deeply into those. But things like shifting the way Pell Grants work, I believe trying to rename Pell Grants Trump Grants is one of the plans on deck. But also making it harder for people to take out loans. And then we've also been trying to reckon with a proposal from the Department of Education to privatize or sell off the portfolio of existing student loans. And it seems like, given recent announcements, the Department of Education may still be trying to get out of the business of providing federal student loans altogether.
Might be worth probing a little bit about. There was a discourse 2021 to 2024 that was in the Biden years. There were a couple arguments. One is too many people are going to college, and this was at times Democrats say. Like,
Mhm.
what do we think about that as an argument, as a point of comment?
Yeah, it's, so many things were going on. So th there to one degree, um, the narrative about college affordability, um, there was a discourse that was sending people to college as the American dream and a promise that was not necessarily going to pay out the same way for different people. And there were some people who said that no matter the cost, this is worth it. There were other people who said you shouldn't have to do that to make it worth it. Um, and who what I think is really important is I'm thinking of another sociologist, Tracy McMillan Cottom's work on this in talking about the education gospel, which kind of covers up a multitude of other problems with society, where education is being made to try and cover for the fact that we have, a poor labor market, that people aren't sure of what like life chances they're gonna have without college, that it becomes kind of the floor that you require, and that people are, doing worse and worse without that floor.
Right.
So a lot of the gains that people have from graduating from college are only relative to people who don't have a college degree, is only because of the sliding fortunes of people without a college degree. And so I have been interested in the
I think
argument
Jesse
that
kind of hints that, like, it's less that a college degree is a credential and more that not having a college degree is almost a decredential, is what she's
yeah,
kind of getting at, right?
right, a negative credential,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Um And so, I think that I have been among those pushing for robust reinvestment in public higher education, such that everybody who wants to go can go and major in the things they want to major in, because I think that it promotes a healthy society. And also, we're going to need teachers and nurses and doctors and engineers, and that we need people who are not just like chasing that one major that this year they're promised is going to get them the career that can repay the investment. So I think that um, I think that the push of saying too many people are attending college is coming alongside the last few decades opening up of universities to a more diverse student body. And as I and others have found, that has accompanied a major shift in how we think of the provision, especially of public higher education, to from this collective good model to an individual good model that you have to pay for individually, often through loans. And so I think I don't think you should have to go to college in order to do well in your career, or to like have a fulfilling career for you if you don't want to go. But I also think and so I don't think people should be pressured to attend as like do or die. But I also think that that goes alongside in my ideal world, everybody who wants to go and spend time reading about what's our society and what are we doing, what do we owe to each other, can do that and spend a few years without this incurring a major, major cost on their lives. And so I think sometimes this, like, well, it's not for everybody push can be this conservative, like, I mean, small c conservative type of vision of like, well, we want to keep this like an elite playground, and that only certain people should be allowed to have those conversations.
And then that, because I think part of what I want to make sure I understand for people is like, part of it, there's a disagreement among people who probably voted for Harris on
Yeah.
higher education. I think it's like worth starting there, because
Hmm.
then the Trump fight some of them makes more sense. The other thing
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about was like, you were involved in writing some proposals about student debt cancellation.
Yeah.
And I guess I remember 2022 and 23, in which lots of liberal graduates of Princeton and University of Michigan, whose parents paid for it, being very, very outraged that there was student cancellation for others. Like,
Hmm.
help me explain why. Can I explain why student debt cancellation was worthwhile, not just for teachers,
Hmm.
not just for teachers or these certain jobs, but sort of for the broad public? Why was it a useful goal?
Yeah, it feels like a definite moment in time that is so far away, but I do think it's an important predecessor to getting here, because the education gospel framework was very dominant, especially in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, like the 2010s. Um, and as again, to draw on Macmillan Cottom, um, she pointed out how she was very early in pointing out how predatory components of this industry and like the for-profit colleges were we're taking advantage of the weak job market and pressures to, improve your credentials after the Great Recession by taking in this onslaught of people who've been forced out of the job market or otherwise vulnerable, and pointing out that their industry really, feeds off of economic uncertainty. And one thing that Macmillan Cottom warned was that really made me uncomfortable at the time was how higher ed had this identity as like, we're not like that. We are all good. Like we are only benevolent. Take on any amount of debt and come join us, because it will always be good for you. And she was pointing to what at the time were early trends, and I think has really blossomed into a much more developed component of the nonprofit higher education institutions, which is coming to look more like the allegedly lower ed colleges that they were, differentiating themselves from. So the same strategies of who they're recruiting, who, you know, of policies, of partnerships, public-private partnerships, um, going in a much more career-focused direction of saying, oh, we could be doing mini credentials, we could be targeting people coming back to school and older adults, we should be doing online programs, and that a lot of this is hinging around like bringing in more revenue. Um, so anyway, that's a bit off of what you were asking for, but I think that there is still a group that has a older model of like older conversation about higher ed policy that was predicated on a different group of people attending and a different model of higher education, and which more college is like always the key to economic mobility. And where I and others came in the late 20 teens was in looking at the data in terms of what was showing up in terms of outcomes for assuming student loans in particular, and the racial disparities in student loans. So my group, working with Vafshar and Chenier, found that in our first piece, we found that Black student debt had tripled in just 12 years at the household level, and that already by then a third of Black households were holding student debt, and that this was going up much faster than white households. And we saw this as the outcome of what Trusting Macmillan Cottom and others had been pointing to as this what we called predatory inclusion, that you got access to an institution you'd been denied previously, but on terms that negated the benefit of access.
The terms both being the cost was going to be much higher than you expected and much higher than the white students paid a generation ago, and also that the expectation was that you were supposed to foot the bill on your own, and this is the way we were going to solve racial inequality through
Right.
education on your back, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then what other people were finding at the same time was that these racial debt disparities were growing over time. So, the Black and white graduates leave school with Black graduates leaving school with more debt, and then that gap is growing over time. That was extremely concerning to us in looking at how that claim that you were just laying out then compounds an inequality when we add in like racial job discrimination and all the other factors that are like differences in wealth in your family and your ability to pay down your debt. And so what we were realizing was that not only was there student debt crisis, but this was heavily racialized, and that we needed to use that data about what had transpired over the last 10 years, like after Obama federalized student loans, for instance, and to rethink like, yes, that was Obama. Yes, there were good intentions behind this, and a lot of people thought this would work. But we needed to look at what the outcomes were from this project that had drastically driven up student loans very quickly.
One other thing that happened in the Biden years is worth noting is that there's evidence of growing education polarization, meaning college graduates are voting more Democratic, non-college graduates are voting more Republican, and this also made my sense is this also made the Democrats nervous about defending higher education. That was my impression is they're worried that the camp that's making if you defend the university, you're annoying the students who are not part of the people who are not part of the
Mhm.
university, essentially.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think Democrats in general are afraid of like embracing any like statement made about them. They're like, we're not like that. And so I think I think that's a part of this, and I think also then they kind of buy into that stereotype of, like, because they're college graduates, they must be also, like, white, cosmopolitan,
Right.
like, wealthy elites, and instead being like, "No, that's a sign of how to be part of the working class these days often still requires, like, some form of college education, and it may not look like going to Harvard, it probably doesn't. Maybe that you went to the community college and that you were getting your, like, nursing assistants, like, certification, and so
Higher education is required for a lot of jobs, and it's not being a campus for 4 years at Yale. Right. Yeah, exactly.
yes,
Yeah.
right, and very few students are going to Yale.
Right.
Like, 75% of students even now go to public universities, and community colleges are always under discussed in these debates. So that's another element of how, like, the debate that people were having was, and especially about student debt cancellation, was premised on this image that they had in their head of a college student from maybe the 90s who was like either going to the Ivy League or a flagship sports focused institution like my own, but
Whose
even at
parents are middle class and whose parents probably, did pay for a lot and could, yes.
yeah, who's not working to pay their way through school, and that does not reflect the reality of the students at the public institutions I have worked at, where, the white students are also working class. They're working, up to full time often, and they are taking class overloads to try and graduate as fast as possible and minimize their debt load. They are living governed by this economic pressure because they've been told you have to do this to get a job. And then they're also having to make decisions about their major, not based on their interests, but what they are think maybe kind of has a chance of getting them a job after this. So that was, I think a big part of the disconnect in the discussion about what made student debt cancellation allegedly regressive or not. And what we were looking at, what our analysis showed when we were working on Warren's student debt cancellation plan was that the people who would be most benefiting from up to $50,000 of cancellation were people who'd been to community college, people who hadn't graduated, people with lower wealth, and people of color were more likely to have all of their debt canceled than white folks were. But that it was very universally benefiting to a significant component of the 40 plus million Americans who held student debt, and think about all their families who basically hold that debt with them, would have benefited from this. And I will just say, because because I was part of that debate for so long, you put that to 2023. I feel like it was most active in 2020 or so, but 2023 was when Supreme Court overturned Biden's debt relief plan. And by then, I heard nary a word from all those people who'd been saying student debt was regressive. Instead, the groups that were coming out to say, get rid of Biden's debt relief plan were people who either said, this would harm the military's ability to recruit, which used the pressure of college debt to recruit. It would harm, public defenders who required on underpaid lawyers needing student debt relief to continue, or even a group from Wisconsin claiming that this plan might was had the goal of racial equity, and therefore they took issue with it. So I thought it was really interesting that nobody out of all those groups said this is regressive. They were showing to me, the true colors of the people pushing for the status quo, which is like this debt is an instrument of control, and it leads people to live their lives governed by discipline of that student debt creates, and that there are a lot of people who benefit from that.
So I wanted to lead up to the Biden part in part because I think now we entered an administration where higher education was under all these discourses and divides, that it was not like a unified Democratic stand. We defend higher ed education, as it was competing views of that. This administration has come in with a very unified stand, which is that the current colleges are liberal and woke and annoying and full of annoying professors teaching Marxism. And also, two people are going to college, and we are going to sort of destroy all of that. So how does that feel? Like, you're at a college, you're not at one of the colleges that they, as far as I can tell, they're not doing is they're more these people are snobs, so they're very obsessed with 7 or 8 schools and Harvard and so on. So what's happening? How do you feel the sort of anti-higher education agenda of the Trump administration?
I've been thinking about this in that there's contradictory, it is a unified stance in some ways in terms of like coming after higher education as a
Yes.
symbol of all the things they hate. And I think in some ways it is quite like simple in that these institutions are the places of production of knowledge that would be able to help people identify and analyze and undermine their statements of what is true.
Right.
And so we are the primary places where that could happen. And when you look at the first things that they've been doing, both through actions and through people self-censoring, is censoring our ability to discuss what they are doing.
Let me be
Because
clear about this. So they are nervous about higher education for their right to be nervous. Higher education is a thing authoritarians attack, and they're just probably smart to do that on some level. It makes sense they do that, right? You're challenging their authority in a certain way.
I'm not,
I don't want
to
to
be
defend
clear,
it.
I
I'm
don't
not praising it. I'm just
I'm
saying
not
it's a
praising it, but it is a common tactic, as you said, among authoritarian governments, because if your uh, world relies on the production of propaganda, then having a educated populace specifically who can analyze and identify propaganda as such, that is going to be a problem. And I also think this is, to me, a plug for the humanities as a English major, that um we've done so much like dismissal of the value of a humanities major, but when you think about what texts you are reading and learning how to critically analyze and how to like think about language and not just on this superficial level,
hmm.
that I want to make a plug for. It's not just like doctors and teachers that I think that I'm standing up for, but even like being able to read a novel requires like, what are novels about? They're often about authoritarian governments and like what happens next. Or for us to read history, and I spend so much time with my students just talking about history. The administration has said that what they're banning is faculty talking about ideology. I spend all of my time in classes just talking about historical facts, things that occurred that they had no idea that happened, or even recent past events that they weren't tracking, because I just feel like we need to build up a bigger knowledge base for students. And so I think that is like a major part of the intellectual project of attacking higher education, in terms of like generating alternative sources of information. But I think you said that they're obsessed with those Ivy League places. I think there's a lot of competing elements, that they both want to destroy these places, and they want to, like, they know that these places confer status, and
They
that
want to control them. They want to destroy them. That's what they want to destroy them, or just control them, and maybe a little bit of both. Yeah,
I think it's both, and I think
yeah.
we need to understand that tension when we're trying to say, "Is it really this or is it really that?" It's really
Yeah.
both. It doesn't all make sense put together. They are dismantling higher education, the Department of Education, at the same time that they're weaponizing it to control universities, and it's not just one or the other. They're What they do want is to transform these spaces so that they are unrecognizable, and I think that is already happening, and like similarly to how they want these spaces of education to be more exclusive, like with a student body that better represents what it used to, and is likely to be whiter and maler and better off. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they want the resources of all the knowledge and education to come with it. Like, I think there's an element of that scamification of higher education that I was talking about with the like growth towards lower ed, that is gonna stay, that like what you don't wanna just eliminate these institutions, you want them to be singing your song. So, like, they want, like, all of these places to be on board with saying the same statements that like reflect and validate what they've been claiming about the world.
And in a
And
school like yours, I can't tell what the University of Iowa is, which is a state school, flagship school, good school, but like not, not as expensive and elite as the sort of Dukes. Like, so I guess they just following the news, it seems like the red states, and not just Trump, they want the professors to be nervous about talking, right? That's
Mhm.
one thing. They definitely want you to feel nervous about speaking your truth, right?
Right. Yes.
And do you feel nervous about do you feel, I mean, you're here, so I mean, you're not too nervous, but do you feel nervous?
Well, I mean, speaking it uh it helps that for now, I'm still allowed to speak as myself, as I am doing, and not as a representative of the university. Um, and this is based on my research. So, there's all the for now, we there's some red lines that are being crossed in places like Texas, where
I'm referring.
where the where the rules are explicitly coming for curriculum, or in places like Florida where classes are having like very, very close grained oversight about what you can and can't even say. Um, Different states are at different places in that timeline, which has been true since I worked at Tennessee in 2016, and then Iowa. So this has been happening for a long time, and so I think that I think a lot of faculty are concerned, and yet they also really know these things are important, and they also know that that what is happening in classes is not indoctrination, and that if that this is not like a in good faith critique, that faculty want classes to feel vibrant and intellectually engaging and have people debating one another and bringing in ideas. And I would say the chilling effect is not just on faculty, it's definitely on students as well. One way that I work on myself to feel comfortable walking into a classroom of strangers and talk about these things that, are so charged right now, is I make them write a lot so I can hear what they're thinking if they're not willing to say it in class.
Mm.
And so many of them express concern or just generalized anxiety about talking, but especially, you know, but they, but I can tell that they are on board with the ideas and that they're learning a lot and that they are wanting to know more. I have so many students, right? These should be a required course for everybody to take at the end of every semester. And so I know that it is important, and that we see so many examples of people uh, anticipating in advance and changing their language. But I also know that it's because it's important to talk about that people are coming after this. And I also feel like the hammer's coming down everywhere. Like, we wouldn't have thought before this year that cancer research would be one of the targets. And so this is not just about us. This is a really collective problem, and it requires solidarity across a lot of different areas, instead of being like, oh, well, the problem is the people who teach about race, like me, or the problem is just this language or environmental justice. And if we just cut that out, I really want to bring attention to the many groups who've been pushing back, like my professional organization, American Sociological Association, which worked with the AFT to sue Trump over their Dear Colleague letter back in February, that was trying to negate or prevent teaching of language about race and gender and sociology generally, and they won. So what I think that when we see that this is not just about like certain words or phrases that are that are problematic now, but that we see that this is a threat to the whole institution, that like opens up new possibilities for solidarity and working together to fight these things, because we've seen when unions and affiliated groups are fighting that they're winning.
Let me close with two questions or two topics I'm talking about. The first is, I think Pete Buttigieg over the weekend said something. He was interviewed somewhere, something along the lines of like Democrats were only talking about identity issues and that turned off people, and
Mhm.
that's why we lost. And so I guess I have two sort of feelings about that comment. I wanted to give you that. One is like, no, that's actually not what happened. Did you know that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were leading the Democratic Party? Joe Biden talked about infrastructure every day, and what are you talking about? The other was sort of like to sort of lean into like what he's saying and really probe it, is like, if you mean Black Lives Matter and Me Too and trying to solve the racial wealth gap are identity issues,
Mhm.
I guess that's true. But I don't think those are like frivolous and silly and not worth discussing. And I think so. How do you, when you read it, I mean, I'm not quoting
Mhm.
Buttigieg, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
just in general, Democrats are too woke and too focused on identity
Mhm.
issues. Like, how do you hear that?
Yeah. I think, firstly, to as a scholar of racial inequality, and who's addressed written a lot about ideas of racial progress, for instance, is that our linear myth of how progress works is not how society works, and instead we often have a backlash. Like
Right.
when we see social progress in things like recognizing that Black Lives Matter, this very, very basic fact, or recognizing that the racial wealth gap exists. not even saying we're gonna like, fix it.
And not certainly not fixing it. Even if we said we were gonna fix it,
Yeah.
we didn't fix it at all. Right.
Just mentioning it.
Just mentioning it.
And
Yes.
so we're living through a period of backlash as we have before, which is the reason why, speaking of historical facts, I always teach about redemption as the period following Black Reconstruction to say, like, look, there's period, like, society moves forward and then people work on recreating all of the structures, but even more in a different way, with a new form of violence than previously. And I think you could say we're living through that now. Um, so it makes sense that a lot of people will look at that and be like, "Oh, we went too far because now look what happened." And I think that that's why we need scholars of history to be like, "That's not how that works." And that, I've known plenty of people who've pointed out that what we're living through right now is a form of identity politics in terms of like, grievance politics around what they perceive as like the assertion that equality should be possible, is offensive to people who have benefited so long from hoarding resources. And and so, like, I think that there is a way to, I was also just teaching about intersectionality this past week and talking about Crenshaw's point that identity politics, as she was framing them, were not about dividing groups and comparing them. It was about building solidarity across groups and coalition building specifically. And I would hope that people just could realize that, like, he can be part of a very large coalition, and that identity politics is about like recognizing the commonalities across different forms of problems and like what you do out of that together. And it's really not about people like as individuals and their specific issues, except insofar as they become political when they're shared together. And that and that this, I mean, it's a way to demean and devalue a really important movement that's like, where I think I just think that it's that these it's also a way to try and put that in behind us in the same way that, like, Susan Faludi in her book Backlash was saying that after every advance for women's rights, people would come back and smooth smooth all that history away and be like, "Yeah, that never happened." Like, where we that went way too far, and yet it never happened, and now where we are is good. And I've been thinking about that, about how often she identified people being like, "Oh, has feminism gone too far?" And I think we're living through the exact same thing now where, like, one step forward is, well, that's we were not ready for that.
And I'll close with you had a Blue Sky note. This is on January 19th, 2025. So early on, very early on, but
Timestamp.
it's been proven this very prescient. The attack on humanities slash social science education courses, departments, the removal of books from K through 12 libraries, and the rush to AIFI higher ed all have the same outcome. It's different ways to neutralize knowledge, whether by erasing it or turning it into bland porridge. And I think it's brilliant that you got AI in there before AI sort of turned into what it is on some level, but I think you really got there. So what is it? Why is it important for someone like Donald Trump to neutralize knowledge?
So that then whatever he says is correct, because knowledge is about that multiplicity of ideas, and it is about being able to learn what is happening. Like, we're losing our ability as social scientists to even measure what is happening, and that's not by accident. So our ability to name, to compare, to use theories to make predictive predictions like I was doing on January 19th, to be able to look at a system like AI and be like, what is this for? That's the type of thing that we do as scholars, and which I really enjoy getting to teach students who may not have thought of themselves as deep thinkers, to start asking questions that they can't answer, and be really excited for them. And know that I've now, troubled them for the rest of their lives, that
Sure.
they're going to realize that there's things that we don't know the answer to, and that they might need to, like, figure it out, or live with contradictions. And, um, just the ability to, like, remember what was happening last week is eroding out from under us. And so, you know, like, just being able to anchor ourselves to this infrastructure that we have built as elitist and problematic as it has been, as the ability to record facts and track what's happening and like, stay true to our values is going to be all the more important. And we know that because they are attacking it. We know that from the empty bookshelves that those books mattered. And so yeah, I think like the more that they come for dish specific area is the way I know that it matters.
They're attacking higher education for a reason.
Yes.
It's a great way to end. Professor, thank you so much for joining me. Good to see you.
Thank you. Bye.